sometimes young teachers are always looking for the educational research answer because that's the kind of trendy talk at the moment. And I want to say, no. Well, what about the children in front of you? What have you found to be the most effective way of learning?
Hello, I'm Tom Rogers, and this is the Rebel Education Podcast. Research. Everybody is talking about educational research. It's the big thing in education at the moment. If you log on to Twitter or Facebook or any form of social media, you will see that people are really leading a conversation about educational research. And a lot of the comments that are made, people will also sub-comment that you should refer to this piece of research. It is the buzzword. It is what is happening right now. It's coming from politicians, it's coming from educational media, it's coming from bloggers. It's a tidal wave. So the question I want to ask in this podcast is about the role of educational research. What do we think about it? Is it useful? How useful? Are there pitfalls with it? And the first thing I want to do is offer my opinion on it, and a little bit of background as well on this whole movement that's happened over the last few years. And probably a good place to start would be 2013, when an organisation called Research Ed was set up by Tom Bennett and Helen Galdin O'Shea. And I think they both deserve enormous credit for this organisation, which has brought research findings to the teacher's door. They have organised conference after conference around the UK and around Europe, which has hosted teachers who want to delve deeper into what educational research says. And in my view, an awareness of what academic researchers are saying in regard to different teaching practices is always going to be beneficial. I think this is absolutely fantastic. I think this is brilliant. However, there are some limitations, and I do have some concerns. Firstly, when we raise educational research or evidence-based practice to the status of sacrosanct, untouchable. When somebody says, well, there's this piece of research that says this, so therefore you're wrong, I'm concerned about that. Second is when individuals or institutions use it for their own ends. So we're talking about businesses. We're talking about individuals who perhaps are promoting certain agendas. And thirdly, when it's used or applied in a way that can restrict teacher development, because I think every single teacher needs time and space to work out how they best teach. You could have the best method, but it might not be the best method for a particular teacher. And I think that innovation and experimentation is key to a teacher discovering and building their teacher self. So in truth, I personally believe that educational research can only ever be what happened in a number of classrooms with particular students at particular times, with particular teachers, teaching them with particular levels of quality, in particular countries, in particular seasons, testing particular ideas. We hear about research studies in hundreds of classrooms. What about the weather? Was it rainy in those hundreds of classrooms when the teachers were teaching them? Because that could disadvantage the teachers. And I'm not sure if the weather forecast was included in each research study. I'm being cynical here, but I'm just trying to give you an example of different attributes that can impact on what happens in a classroom. So many variables that I don't think educational research can take account of, however valid and sturdy an educational research project is. I mean, the opportunities for divergence are endless. And it's not just me saying that. Dylan Willian, who is probably one of the foremost speakers on educational research, produced a talk which said why teaching will never be a research-based profession. And in that talk, he talked about findings from their Education Endowment Foundation, their teaching and learning toolkit. And one example he gave was on the area of teaching assistants. And this was controversial when it first came out, because it basically said teaching assistants have no impact on the attainment of students, which to everyone who's experienced a classroom seemed silly or ludicrous, because, you know, particularly primary teachers, TAs play a huge role. But the reason he gave as to why that feedback may have said that is because of the fact that in the study, TAs are often excluded, for example, from staff training days, and they don't get the benefit of the CPD that the other teachers do. They might not have time to sit down with the teacher before a class and actually plan with the teacher and work with the teacher on how best to teach that class. They might not have time for that. And then suddenly the research produces this statistic or this ranking table of impacts on educational attainment, but actually it could be misleading. So that's one issue. And he even mentioned on feedback, because it puts feedback as top. And Dylan William talks about the fact that, the feedback might be top, but what particular types of feedback is top of the list? Because that's something that teachers might not have time to look into. So again, it's also about the presentation of the research, not just the content of it or how it was worked out. And the research movement has started to mould the shape of pedagogy in many schools. One example is the cluster of research that talks about direct instruction having the highest impact on student attainment. And we're talking about the regular use of quizzing is another one, to consolidate knowledge, which scores highly in the educational research world. And the overarching philosophy, teach according to what the evidence says, is the best way all of the time. I'm not sure about that. In practice, this has meant teachers being told to ignore less effective activities, for example, more inquiry-based or student-led activities, with the clear and firm reasoning that a mixture of direct instruction, questioning and quizzing will achieve the best results. And in an exam system that's asking students to learn more and more facts in subjects like history, I think that's probably a reasonable approach. But the benefits of different activities can be subtle and they can be discrete, in my view. They can, in essence, be non-measurable. For example, a discovery project-based approach, it might aid student confidence in working collaboratively. They're working in a group, they're talking to each other, and they develop some confidence from that. I'm going to be careful to use the word skills, but they develop confidence. And yes, you need a content basis for that activity. Of course you do. But the way in which the pedagogy behind it, let's question it. Let's ask what benefits it can bring. And it may inspire students to think more creatively, or it might give them the opportunity to think in different ways. But a researcher might struggle to find evidence for this in observation situations or in test results. And actually, as it happens, so would Ofsted. Amanda Spielman said last week, it appeared harder for schools to model progression in terms of skills. Leaders who said they'd attempted to map student progress in developing skills had no secure way of knowing whether students had acquired the defined skills. Well, yes, but you might not be able to see in the moment, in the educational research phase through observation, the skills or the confidence or the development that has taken place, because these are discrete and sometimes hidden skills. But anyway, the inspectorate, with its newfound obsession with all things curriculum, and it won't take you long if you just Google Ofsted curriculum, first 10 articles will probably be from the last few weeks talking about curriculum. They need something to measure schools on with this parameter. And the simplicity of an inspector asking a child, do you know when the First World War started? And then replying 1914. Well, that makes any assessment of curricular impact quite easy. So it's my argument there's a risk that we're confining teaching to like a set of routines or patterns or mechanized systems that kind of put teaching in a box. I think there's components that we need to consider in any imposition of a rule based on educational research. So the first one is the teacher. And in my opinion, every teacher has a different personality and professional identity. Some due to natural character traits, some because they just prefer a different style of teaching. There's been some suggestion that adopting practices that fall outside the realm of educational research could be unprofessional. I completely disagree with that. A way of teaching is only better if that teacher can achieve what they want using that method. If they can't, they should use a different method. And they should have the freedom to do so. If teachers teach the way they feel works for them and their students in their context, then surely that's better than just blindly following the research. I mean, my concern is that in focusing on metadata analysis or whatever, we forget that teaching is like an art form. This is my opinion. I think it's like an art form, and prescribing pedagogy doesn't allow teachers to develop their own style, to understand the role of pragmatic flexibility within the classroom, experimentation, innovation, and so on. The stuff I've already mentioned. And the second one is the learning. And I feel that engagement is so important in learning. You need to be engaged before you learn. Or do you? I mean, certainly, I think to learn the most, then peak engagement is the best place to be fully focused and fully engaged in what you're about to learn. And sometimes I feel that teachers should be able to divert from the learning to some extent to re-establish that peak engagement. And I mean, the analogy I might give is a football team that has a really patient build-up before playing like that incisive pass. So learning isn't just robotic motions, but it's a human experience, and it's something the teacher has to gauge in the moment. And if they want to flip that learning to on a different angle, then I think they should do that, despite what any research says. So in summary, I'm arguing for a more pragmatic and critical approach to academic research. And a much higher profile and status for experiential research. In other words, what a teacher says is working for them and their students in the classroom. I understand that's a popularity points kind of statement, but I honestly believe there's truth in it. It may be a popularity statement, but I think there's truth in it. And my message would be to teachers who are feeling maybe a bit research inferior is that thousands of the best teachers in the world have never read a word of educational research in their lives. So, don't worry if you haven't read 50 papers. In the end, it's you, and your skill, your passion, your experience, and your relationships that matter. That's my opinion on this. But what I want to do is I want to hear other opinions on this topic. We're now going to hear from two head teachers, Catherine Burble-Singh and Simon Smith, one secondary and one primary, to hear what they think about educational research. Let's listen.
Hi, my name is Catherine Burble-Singh. I'm the headmistress of Michaela Community School. On Twitter, I'm known as Miss Snuffy, so that's Miss with an _ Snuffy. I used to write a blog a long time ago where I was Miss Snuffleupagus, essentially from Sesame Street, the elephant in the room. Do I trust educational research? Yes, on the whole. Although I would never do something over and over again without trying it out. I always say what's most important are the children in front of you, and obviously experience matters a lot. You try out different things with children over the years and you come to see what works and what doesn't work. What's the piece of educational research that has influenced my practice the most? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I run Michaela. I don't actually teach at Michaela. I think people know us as a school that values educational research, and we do. We use a lot of direct instruction. We space our practice. We do a number of different things. But all of that is based in experience. Yes, the research might agree with us, but my own experience has demonstrated to me that that stuff works. What do I think the biggest limitation for educational research is? The thing I worry about is, especially with young people in education who are kind of post-2010, is that everything since 2010 is kind of been put up for grabs. And when you tear down truth, it is very hard to know what is right and wrong. And I can find sometimes young teachers are always looking for the educational research answer because that's the kind of trendy talk at the moment. And I want to say, no. Well, what about the children in front of you? What have you found to be the most effective way of learning? And what worries me is that if educational research is given such kind of such a significant amount of time and kind of admiration that people will stop trusting themselves. And I would hate to see that, because experience is the most important thing. So how do I think it can have impact on pedagogy? Well, it already has done, and that's really great. Thank goodness people started talking about educational research in 2010, because before 2010, it was completely ignored. And that was a really sad thing for the country, because all of the great things that have been learned from research, those things were not being applied in the classroom. So it does have its uses. Do I have the concerns about its role in impacting classroom practice? Well, I've already explained that. Less about impacting classroom practice, but more impacting classroom practitioners, that teachers perhaps do not value their own eyes and ears in the classrooms as much as they should. And I want them to do that. But I do think educational research is a very good thing indeed. Lastly, how commonly is educational research being used to influence practice in your experience? I really don't know. If you imagined Twitter to be the educational world, then you would imagine quite a lot. But actually, Twitter probably has about 2% of teachers. So I suspect educational research plays has a very small role in influence in terms of our classrooms. But I actually have no idea, and I'd be very interested to hear if anyone had the answer. Thanks very much for listening to me. Bye-bye.
I'm Simon Smith. I'm Principal at East Whitby Academy. Question 1. Do you trust educational research? I would classify myself as a healthy skeptic, I suppose. I think, as with any research, educational research has its positives and its negatives. It helps us look at the practice we do. It helps us look at the work. What it doesn't do is give us answers. In terms of do I trust it, I think that potentially we're not critical enough of it. We're not critical enough of how that piece of research can work, or the situation in which that research is done, or where that research is funded from. I think there are a range of issues that actually we need to be open to exploring and think about with regards to educational research. So do I trust it? Possibly. Some of it, maybe. Question 2. What is the piece of educational research that has most influenced your practice? I think for me, the piece of educational research that's most influenced not just my practice, but practice in school, is the idea that we need to make sure that children learn stuff. And to do that, we need to, first of all, teach them really well. And then we've got to give them that chance to practice and repeat. And those repeated cycles, it gets given different names now, but it's, I think, interleaving and stuff like that. But actually, it's stuff that's, and ideas that have been around for a significant amount of time. It's not new stuff. It's stuff that actually, over time, has proven that actually it helps children remember stuff. And that's probably the one thing that's really, really most influenced the practice of our school. What do you think is the biggest, question 3, what do you think is the biggest limitation of educational research? I think the biggest limitation of educational research is the size and scale of the research that goes on. I think a lot of educational research isn't transferable, and with any research, it only, in terms of true science, only really helps us ask questions and explore what we do. What it doesn't do is prove anything. And people who constantly go on about educational research proving that this is the way you should do something actually are wrong, because it doesn't do that. And often I worry about the fact that now educational research is used to stop discussion around pedagogy or method, rather than being something that's open, and it's used to dismiss pedagogy rather than to explore it. Now, if we truly want to be a research culture, we have to be open to researching all aspects of pedagogy and curriculum and those things, and finding out what works, but what works best in different schools and in different places. And then we use it as a lens. Question 4. How do you think educational research can impact on pedagogy? Do you have any concerns about its role in impacting classroom practice, or do you think it can only be a good thing? I think if we use it carefully as a tool, as a lens to look at our practice and to help us hone and develop practice, then educational research is a good thing. if we try to use it as a silver bullet, if we try to use it, well, this worked here, therefore it'll work here, and use it as some kind of silver bullet, then ultimately we're going to be disappointed. But actually, it's something that helps us explore what we do and challenges what we do, then I think it can have impact. Final question. How commonly is educational research being used to influence practice in your experience? A bit would be my answer. I think in some places it's being used. In some places it's being used to look at the practice and explore the practice and to help people challenge and use the practice. In other places, it's not being used at all. And, in a number of schools, I'd say people aren't really very aware of it. Educational research has its place and has its purpose. And the more we use it, the more that will help us develop the things that work for us in our schools. And I think that's the key. It's in our schools. And it also fits with your communities, your families, your children, and the teachers that you have working in the space. I'm very wary that it gets used to promote a certain pedagogy or a certain style of teaching, because actually we've been down this road before. We've been down the road where actually educational research put a load of things in our classroom, and a few years later we're pulling those things out and saying, oh no, they're edu myths and that kind of stuff, and calling it nonsense. But actually that's it. That's what research does. Research doesn't prove. Research just allows us to look and explore with more questions, and we've got to look at it in those terms. If we start to use it as answers, then we might as well stop. And that's me just about done.
Thank you very much to Catherine Burblesing and Simon Smith for sharing those insights on educational research. Fantastic contributions to the Rebel Education podcast. We will be back next week. Next week we'll be talking about international teaching. I can't wait, being an international teacher myself. Stay tuned for more. If you want to tweet about this episode, tweet me at Rogers History and follow the Rebel Education podcast on Podbean and iTunes. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a fantastic weekend and I will see you soon. Bye.